Hello and welcome to the Tent of Ideas at the All in the Mind Festival Online 2020. My name's Leigh Johnstone. I'm the Artistic Director of Fluid Motion Theatre Company, and these discussions are all about delving a bit deeper into some of the themes and topics being presented at the festival this year, as well as getting to know some of the people involved. So in this discussion, I'm going to be talking to Dewi Evans. Dewi is a performer, writer, and is about to embark on a PhD at Queen Mary's University entitled Mental Illness, Performance and Autobiography. So a great person to speak to. So let me bring him in now. Is he there? Is he there? He's coming in. Are you there, Dewi?
I'm here. I don't know why. Oh, here we go.
There he is.
Oh,
there he is. Hello. Hello. Welcome, Dewi, to the virtual Tent of Ideas at the All in the Mind Festival.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you. It's good to have you. I did a little introduction then, just briefly about you being a performer and a writer, and the fact that you're about to embark on your PhD. Yeah. Do you want to just give everyone a bit more of a rounded, fuller sense of what you do and what you make?
Yeah, so I find it really difficult to explain what I do because I don't think I'm always quite sure what I do. But I range from sort of one-man performances. I do a little bit of directing, writing shows. I do a little bit of installation, like Shedding My Mental Illness, and that has a performance element in it. And it's sort of, I sort of take a magpie approach to performing arts. It's like, oh, like that, let's do that. Yeah. And then, oh, look, do that. So yeah, so it's sort of a real range, but most of it centres around autobiography and mental illness.
Which is great, because obviously that's my sort of area of focus and interest as well. So I think this is going to be an interesting conversation. We titled this conversation Making Performance with a Mental Illness, I think was the title of this. But we'll come on to that in a bit in a minute. But your idea about taking influences and taking bits of performance from other people and different styles is something that I do as well. I don't quite, I feel now being sort of beholden to one style of performance is a thing of the past. I think, anyway, specifically in the area of mental health in which we're working. I don't know. I just think it's take a bit of installation work, take a bit of outdoor art stuff, bit of indoor stuff, because those audiences that we want to engage with are everywhere. I don't know. Maybe that's I don't know.
No, I agree with you. Like, and I think from my own point of view, sort of being a little bit manic every now and again really helps, sort of to make you go, oh, I'm going to do this, because you fixate on something and pick up on something and work on that. But I also think, like, moving forward, like even before COVID, things were a bit flexible, and I think now, post-COVID, we have to be so flexible and take inspiration from where we can and do performances where we can. Because big theatres might not reopen, festivals will be very different in the future until we have a vaccine or there's herd immunity. So I think having that sort of magpie approach and picking and choosing is really helpful. Plus, I don't think one particular style always works for one particular exploration.
No.
I don't think I could have explored the stuff that I did in Shedding My Mental Illness in a different style, just because of the way that piece was set up, in terms of you being invited into a space that was mine, that was sort of a writer's shed in the style of Dylan Thomas and Roald Dahl, where you had the permission to go and rummage through drawers and write things and use that space how you wanted to as an audience member. And I don't think that would have worked in any other style.
No, I also think there's still that, certainly what I've come across is that sort of reluctance to sort of come into, one, a theatre space, a conventional theatre space, and two, to sort of then be given a performance of a mental health piece. There's sort of two barriers there, which this festival aims at. The aim is to get rid of that. I think that's really interesting. I don't know if you want to, but I realised that I was supposed to start a timer on 30 minutes for this conversation, so I've just done it at 25%. We've set the timer now, just so everyone gets the same amount of time. Do you want to talk briefly about Shedding My Mental Illness, just to give that some context?
Yeah, shedding my mental illness is a weird one because it's kind of as far away as you could get from my training and where I started out as possible. So I started out doing an undergraduate degree in drama, then a master's in music theatre at Central, Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, and then went to sort of Queen Mary to do the MSc in Mental Health and the Creative Arts. And it seems that, like, as I've gotten older, sort of performing me standing up and sort of doing something has sort of moved further and further away until you end up with something like Shedding My Mental Illness, which is this constructed reality, effectively. You know, it's a weird one because it is constructed and it is an artifice, but also at the same time, everyone who knows me who has been in that shed has gone, this could be at the bottom of your garden. Like, this would be at the bottom of your garden if you had a space to do it. And we're thinking about taking it to my mum and dad's and sticking it up in my mum and dad's garden as a permanent thing, as a place for me to work moving forward for the PhD. And it will be virtually identical to what people saw as the piece. And the interesting thing for me with that piece is you got to see me in various different stages. Like when I was working, you could stand outside and watch me work, or you could come in and meet me. And I think it's really interesting when you get to meet actors or artists, one in their own space, but also in a I'm watching you, or like you're performing, you're doing something, and I'm receiving that stuff. And it's something that I found with all artists. Like, I was really lucky to have a conversation with Bobby Baker at the South Bank Festival before COVID. And I just think I think people are much more interesting when you sit with them and have a drink with them, or a cup of tea or whatever, than sometimes when they're performing, because you get a personal interaction. And of course, you need to see their work, and you need to appreciate their work. I just find that dynamic much more interesting.
What were the conversations you had? Because we didn't have that much of an in-depth conversation after the festival about last year when you brought Shedding My Mental Illness. But what were the conversations you had with people at the festival last year? What types of things were people saying? How were they engaging with you?
I think for me, the most profound conversation I had didn't actually happen at the festival. Right. The shed is basically broken up into viewing, meeting, remembering. So viewing, they watch me work; meeting, they meet me and have a conversation, and then remembering, I disappear and go off and do something else and go and see what lovely other things that are happening throughout the festival. And people can rummage through drawers and sit and write and do that sort of thing. And I happened to be coming back to the shed just at the end of that third section, and a chap and his wife just walked off, and the only words he said to me were, "You're having a fantastic way with words." I thought that lovely. And then I think the Monday after the festival, I got a really long email from this bloke, the same bloke.
Oh, really?
Saying that he just had to go home and process everything that he'd read and seen and in the shed, because it had been so resonant with him that he had found it really profound. And I thought that was one of the really interesting conversations, because I'd been invited into his personal space and he had retreated into his personal space to have a conversation with me. And there's that element of safety with personal spaces, where you're in control, it's your space, you can take time to think about what you want to say. And there were plenty of other conversations with people like milling around, and sort of I had some lovely conversations with some of the artists that were at the festival, some of the people who were just visiting the festival. And because it was a nice sunny day, we put some chairs outside the shed, and I ended up having conversation with people about their own mental illnesses, about their own struggles. And I think it really opens a conversation up that people sometimes aren't willing to have.
Let's talk about the main point then, sort of how we make art with mental illness. Because I think some of the stuff you've said then already, and I always, because I'm a theatre maker obviously myself, and I do a lot of autobiographical work, and I've done my own show, I have those experiences as well that I bring into conversation with artists through the tent of ideas. And I was just talking that idea of rummaging through stuff and sort of opening up your life, for me, I don't know if it's the same with you and your work, but it took me ages to get to that point where I was able to let people come in. And how much, it's an open-ended question potentially, but how much do we need to open up? How do we do? How much of our lives do we let an audience see? There's no, I don't think, one answer to that, but it's just an interesting first question, I think.
For me, what I allow people to see is controlled.
Yeah.
And I think like anyone who says, oh, they can just come in and wander in and it all is fine, I think is lying. Because you've put things in that piece for a specific reason. And yeah, okay, in something like The Shed, where like everything is in there and you've got thousands of artifacts, they have all been chosen for a reason. And other things have been deliberately left out. And that was one of the questions that we sort of considered when doing The Shed, is like, how much of my self-harm do I share? How much of my suicide ideation do I share? Because I don't want that to trigger other people. There are references to it in The Shed, but it has been carefully constructed with care. I don't want people to go away from that piece feeling worse than when they entered. And if we have a conversation around it face to face, then that's fine, because in that moment I can mediate that conversation with that person, and it's how much they feel safe, because I'll never push someone to divulge more than they want to. But there are certainly things that I don't talk about. Like, I don't really talk about my mum and dad. There are photos of my mum and dad in there, but my relationship with them is a dual story. It's not my story, it's our story. So to avoid that a one-way bias narrative about my mum and dad, I wouldn't necessarily have that conversation without them involved in some way. Just the same as my partner Luke was involved in the construction of The Shed, and he had to say about what went in about him, just the same as my friends did. And I think we do deliberately hold things back, and anyone who says they don't is either lying or they're not thinking about it properly.
Yeah. And I think that's the idea of permission and, you know, an authenticity, and that sort of whole idea of, you know, when I did my show around, you know, my mum and her alcoholism, and that, you know, I had to ask her. And it's, you know, and that is her story as much as it is mine. It's my experience. It's my lived experience that I'm performing. But, you know, we had a real conversation around, we didn't want to portray my mum as the bad person.
Yeah.
And that was really interesting. So I think going back to the very beginning of how we make work, when was the first time you put your own story on stage or performed your own story?
That's a question that sort of leads into an argument about how much of when you're performing as somebody else is
well,
your
we could get into
well, but we'll avoid that, because that would be a very long conversation.
Yeah.
I think for me, that's the first time I wrote something was in 2013, I think, and that didn't really have any autobiographic elements in it. The sort of relationship that one of the characters has with one of the other characters is kind of symbolic of my relationship with my grandmother, but it's not my story. It's a complete fiction. And the irony about that piece is it's about a woman with dementia. And 2 years ago, my grandmother was diagnosed with dementia.
Wow. Okay.
So it's actually gone the other way. It's like, and I look at this story now and go, oh my God, like some of the stuff that's in there is now happening to me. But the first time that I sort of really started talking about my own experience was probably two or 3 years ago. Okay. I've always written autobiographical poems and letters and pieces, but I never really shared them or showed them. And it was a way of me processing my illness and sort of dealing with the sort of maelstrom of emotions that I feel with my bipolar disorder. But it wasn't until sort of 2005 where somebody went, you do realise that like the bulk of your work is about mental illness, that I went, oh, okay, and sort of reevaluated.
Yeah.
And then started to tell my story more, because that's also when I had another major episode. And so sort of the two things seemed to collide at roughly the same time, and it's worked.
You sort of covered it briefly, but where do you think that desire in you comes from to sort of perform elements of your own story? Does it come from that ability to process your own mental health, or is it more you just wanting to perform, or is it a mixture of both?
I think it's a mixture of me wanting to perform. Like every time I've gone and got what would be called a proper job.
Yeah.
I've hated it and ended up going back into performance anyway.
Yeah.
But I also think there's an element of sort of catharsis, sort of getting out of emotion in me, because every time I tell the story, it gets a little bit easier. Sort of telling your narrative for once is hard, and then the second time it's a little less hard, and then by the time you've reached to the millionth time, you're completely fine with it. But I also think there's an element of, I have always been really open as a person. So I've always been open about the fact that I'm gay. I've always been open about the fact that I'm bipolar. And a lot of people think that that's bravery. I don't see that as bravery. I see that as, when I grew up, there were very, 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 very few role models to look to.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of, like, I grew up in the age of Section 28 and all of that horrible stuff, and like, people didn't really know what it was like to be gay. So I found that just by talking to people understand you more. People can empathize with you. And that's a really powerful way of changing people's minds and changing perspectives. And so that sort of has just continued on and on and on. And the thing is like, there's so many preconceptions about being gay or being bipolar or being mentally ill that don't get challenged. So just by doing a little bit and challenging one person, it's sort of, you hope that eventually, if one person talks to one person and another person talks to another person, eventually society will change its attitudes.
So so for you, it is about, one, being a performer, but also about performing that to a wider audience in order to make sure that opinion, or that issue gets raised in more of a wider context or sphere. You know, I'm just thinking, because I was thinking around as well. Do you need to be, you know, talk about theatre here. Obviously, there are other art forms in which you can talk about your own, you know, your own autobiography. But think about theatre specifically. Do you think you need to be a performer in order to be loud's not the right word, but in order to tell your story on stage? Do you need to be an actual, you know, do you need to have trained or have some sort of, what are your thoughts?
So I'm really glad you asked this question, because I used to run a community drama group in London, and some of the people in that drama group who had never been anywhere near a stage before were some of the best actors I've ever worked with. And I don't think you necessarily need to be a trained, qualified, I've gone to Royal Central, I've gone to RADA kind of person to be a fantastic performer. You know, there are plenty of politicians who are fantastic performers. There are plenty of lawyers who are fantastic performers. There are plenty of teachers. You know, we have performances every day. You know, everyone performs to a certain degree throughout the whole of their life. And I think having the right people around you enables you to perform. Having the right support system is always valuable. But I certainly don't think that you need to have gone to drama school or university or anything like that to perform. I think anyone can do it as long as they have the right skill set. And that can be learned vocationally, or it can be natural talent, or it can just be something you learn over time through an AMDRAM course.
I agree, completely agree. And I think also part of the work we try and do with All in the Mind is to sort of empower anyone, you know, to go, look, the arts can do all of the stuff you've said around making sense of an illness, or talking, you know, about an issue to a wider group of people. The idea is that hopefully for us, the festival empowers people to do that, whoever you are. So I completely agree with you on that. Talk about safety now as well, in terms of performing and performance, and how we create performance around mental health and autobiographic performance. What are your sort of, how do you keep yourself safe in the space, and how do you sort of, I'm also trying to think, you know, if someone was watching this, a theatre maker interested in creating their own autobiographical piece at some point in the future, what are some of the top things we could tell them about how to keep themselves safe in the rehearsal process?
For me, time has been a big way of keeping myself safe. So I had a major episode in when I was 21 at university. No, it wasn't even 21. I think I was 19, 20. I had another major episode probably 10 years later at 29. And I'm much more comfortable with the episode that happened at 19 because I'm so much older than I necessarily am with the stuff that's happened more recently. And I think time is a great element for perspective. I always tell people if they've written a script, stick it in the bottom of a drawer for 6 months and then go back to it, because that allows you to sort of look at it in a more objective way. But also there are things I'm never going to tell people. I'm just never going to tell people for my own safety. And that's because I don't think I'm ever going to be ready for those things to be out in the world. It'd be like opening Pandora's box. Once it's out there, you have no control over it. And so that's a really good way of keeping yourself safe. If there's something you don't want to talk about, don't talk about it, and don't let anyone make you talk about it. You know, there is a pressure that I was going to work with a theatre in London to develop my autobiographical work, and they wanted to take it to a place that I wasn't comfortable with, and into a style that I wasn't particularly comfortable with. So I said no. And it's really difficult, because actually that would have been an amazing opportunity that sort of would have pushed my career to the next level. But to sort of do that kind of work, it would have been too difficult for me. I probably would have bolted out of performance altogether. And so I think it's about to thine own self be true, really. If you're the best judge of what safety is for you. But also I found having a really good support network of friends. I've got some of the most amazing friends on the planet who have known me for 20 years, some of them, you know, and I run stuff past them, they run stuff past me. And they're a pretty good judge as well of going, are you sure about that? You know, because I can't always trust myself to be in the best mental state because of my bipolar. I might be manic, I might be depressed. I'm a pretty good judge of that now. But every now and again, somebody does have to go, are you sure? Are you not manic? Like, is that something you want to talk about? And also, like, the fact that these people aren't anywhere near the industry. The closest person I've got to me is a poet. You know, who's a slam poet. She stands up on stage and does her poems. But I've got lawyers, accountants, fire safety experts, you know, who have a completely different worldbook, who have a completely different perspective. And they're really good at going, are you sure about this? Because they might think of something that I've never thought about. And they're always really, really, really supportive, even if I go, no, I'm putting that in there because of this, and this.
And they're also the audience, aren't they? So, and I think that idea of making sure that you are not forced into going down any path or any style that you're definitely not comfortable with is really important. And actually, and you said, you know, then that actually that wrong move could have put you off performing for the rest of your life. And you know, that's not worth it. It's absolutely not. It's not worth it at all. And I think there is an assumption that autobiographical performance has to be literally bearing your soul, everything on stage in one sort of one-man show or one-woman show or whatever it is, and everything's out there. But actually, you're right. And when I did my show, the catharsis came because I was in control of my own story. Whereas I felt, I don't know if you felt similar, not to slag off any you know, any other service, but for me, counselling, I couldn't get on with counselling because I felt like I was being told I had to say a certain thing, or I had to think a certain way, or I had to go with what they were telling me, and I don't know. Whereas performing the show, I was able to be in control over time, which again is really important, as you've just said. Having the time to really think about what story do I want to tell, and ultimately all that together, then I was able to deal with it, because over time, as you've said, again, every performance you do, it gets a bit easier.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've been really lucky that, like, the two counsellors that I've seen have been absolutely amazing, and I could not praise them high enough.
Yeah, I'm sure there are fantastic counsellors out there.
I also know plenty of people who have had the same experience that you've had. And I think that having control over your narrative is really important. There's an amazing book by Arthur W. Frank called The Wounded Storyteller that is all about how people with illness, and it mainly deals with physical illness, but you can extrapolate it to mental illness, and how having control over your narrative, whatever kind of narrative it is really important for people. Because if we don't have control over our own narratives and our own life stories, we can get lost and we can get pushed into places, and that's not healthy for anyone, you know. And I know that every autobiographic performance maker that I can think of, they have their own style and they tell their story in the way that they want. You know, nobody copies anyone else.
No.
Because to copy somebody else or to sort of go and try and do something in somebody else's style is a disservice to yourself and your narrative and your way of doing things.
We've got only 4 minutes left, Dewi. It's rushed by, but I've got two questions I thought I'd put to you.
Yeah.
It's difficult, obviously, now in our post-lockdown, our COVID world, where obviously not a lot of performance has been happening. However, I was going to ask what you've seen recently, autobiographical and around mental health, that's interested you, or anything that you've seen or come across or read, something that's been powerful for you recently. There might not be anything, but I just thought I'd ask you that question first of all.
There's a really good book that's on my bookshelf. The Lives They Left Behind, and it's about. It's not really autobiographical. It's about the Willard State Asylum in New York, and how when the asylum was closed, I think in the early 90s or the late 80s, they found loads of suitcases in an attic. And how then they pieced these people's lives back together using what was left in these suitcases. And the book only goes through 8 of them. There's hundreds of them in a storage facility somewhere in New York that still have to be gone through. And the thing that I found really interesting about that is how our lives can be pieced back together from our stuff. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
But also, one of the overwhelming themes I thought for that book was how people's narratives were ignored, how if people had been listened to rather than pathologized and sort of given medication, how these people who spent 60, 70, 80 years in an asylum could have been discharged in a fraction of the time. And it's also really interesting to sort of, as a critique of the asylum system. Okay, yeah, it's American, but I think we were just as bad. And how people were basically slaves in these systems because that's the workforce that the asylums needed at the time to run. And it's a really interesting book, I think.
Great. 2 minutes left. Here's the last question. We could talk forever. I think these 30-minute tent of ideas I think they're a good starting point, but I reckon next year we could do hour-long discussions in person. But anyway, 30 minutes is what we have. Last question. This is a big question, but I wonder if you feel what's the future of autobiographical performance around mental health? What's missing? What stories haven't been told that you feel could be told? That's a big question, I know, but just interesting to get your thoughts on that.
I think it's going to be an emerging genre. I think it's a genre that's going to get bigger. I think we have an impending mental health crisis on top of the mental health crisis we currently have. And that's in terms of what's happened during COVID. People haven't processed any of that yet. And it will be maybe 2, 3, 5, 10 years where work about people's mental illnesses and mental health during COVID comes out. I also think that I think in terms of performances of mental illness and autobiographical works of mental illness, I think it will become more and more and more in demand and more vital as civil rights moves forward. Civil rights have sort of stalled over the last 30 years, I think. And sort of now people are getting back on their feet and sort of voting, you know, and engaging in demonstrations because of what's happened with Black Lives Matter. And I think one of the problems we have overwhelmingly with stories of mental illness in the theatre, in performance, is they are made and displayed by people who are not mentally ill.
Yes.
And for me, going and seeing, obviously you can't have somebody with dementia playing King Lear. They'll never remember the bloody lines. There has to be a check and balance. Yeah. And for me, I've been to see numerous shows which have been written about mental illness that don't ring true, either because of the writing or the way that the director has taken the show. And I think if that had happened with a BAME group or gay groups or any other group, people would be outraged because there was no voices at the table. You know, there was a big thing a few years ago about I think it was Falsettos in London, which is about has a Jewish narrative to it, and there were no Jewish people in the cast, and no Jewish people were invited to sort of engage in the creative process. And I think that is where the next big thing will be. It is including people with lived experience, either in the cast or in the creative team or in the process of creating a piece. Because if we're trying to decolonize stories of mental illness, and that's kind of what we're all doing with our autobiographies of mental illness, is sort of taking them away from psychiatrists and psychotherapists and counsellors and saying, this is what I felt, and this is what happened, in a non sort of, oh, you've got bipolar disorder and you've got this and that from the ICD-10 and the DSM-5. I think that would be the really important thing. Right. I think people having their voice and decolonizing that experience and being present, and I think that's the big thing, is being present in the formation of those stories and those productions.
Well, that's a great ending, Dewey. That's a great ending. We've come to the end of our 30-minute discussion.
I'll get off on a soapbox.
Yes, yeah. But no, thank you for joining me and talking. We could talk far more about a lot of that, and especially around autobiography as a, or maybe for next year. Yeah. But thank you so much. You're performing at the festival, obviously, with
yes.
So we can, audiences can see more of you there. But yeah, thanks for joining me, and take care.
Thanks, mate. I'll hopefully see you soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.